My name is Pauline Oosterhoff. I'm a research fellow at IDS in the Gender and Sexuality cluster. As the name suggests, I do a lot of work on gender and sexuality, usually with a focus on human rights and a rather strong urban interest. I've done 2 pieces of research that highlight some of the challenges, the political challenges, economic challenges that are there in peri-urban or unplanned urban settings with regards to health. And I will illustrate some of these challenges with work that I've done together with local researchers. So it's not just me. So in part 1, I'll be talking about the lack of evidence-based urban health planning. First, it's important to know that most people today live in urban areas, 54% to be exact. Many of those live in unplanned urban environments, also called slums or sometimes peri-urban areas. What they have in common is that they're not really planned. By 2050, more than 2/3 of the world's population is expected to live in cities. And when we talk about urbanization, it is important to realize that that is also affecting very remote and indigenous areas. So it is not something that is specific to areas where there are already lots of airports and lots of traffic and lots of industries. It affects the whole world. For example, Meghalaya, which is part of India's tribal belt in the northeast, with a predominantly indigenous population, meaning 86% of the population is indigenous, in that state, cities grew with around 20% between 2001 and 2011. So this urbanization clearly has put increasing pressure on urban areas. And today, 1 out of 5 people in the capital of Shillong are slum dwellers. Of course, this is quite small compared to places such as Nairobi, where the majority of people is living in one of the more than 80 slums in that area. But it is still a situation that is changing very rapidly. And maybe within a few decades, Shillong will be closer to Nairobi than we can imagine today. Now, first, it's important to recognize that there are many real and potential health benefits of organized and efficient cities. Many people actually move to cities because they want to find better employment opportunities or a better education or working health services. Urban residents can actually benefit from better access to general and emergency medical care and from many targeted public health intervention that you would not find so readily in rural areas. In concentrated populations, it is also possible to offer specialized treatments or treatment for chronic conditions, simply because the distance is less and therefore they're more likely to be accessible. However, when urbanization is rapid and unplanned, a combination of high population density, poverty, and a lack of infrastructure can actually have a very negative effect on health. For example, it is estimated that around 700 million urban dwellers lack adequate sanitation. As a result of this, urban citizens are faced with high levels of risks to all sorts of illnesses related to a lack of sanitation and lack of water, such as warm infections, cholera, diarrhea, chronic fatigue. Also, outbreaks, such as the recent Ebola outbreak, are now occurring in urban and peri-urban settings, where they are posing new challenges to public health. The old outbreaks were also very difficult to manage, but they were mostly rural outbreaks. And dealing with such outbreaks in urban centers are posing important challenges, not only to national governments, but also to international governance and audiences and organizations. So rapid and unplanned urbanization does bring new social, political and health-related risks. The extent to which such risks can be managed depends actually on how well these cities are governed. So to provide services, it is important to plan. And for planning, one needs data, one needs evidence. That includes epidemiological data or surveillance data or qualitative data, such as feedback about the quality of the services. Only when you have such data can you design tailor-made and responsive policy that fits these urban settings. Now, unfortunately, urban planning in health is pretty poor in most of the rapidly urbanizing countries. Large parts of the world's urban expansion, and it's estimated to be as much as 40%, is taking place in unplanned urban environments. Now, you could argue that the lack of planning allows for creativity, to create room for entrepreneurial and social innovations. It creates new cottage industries. It allows to think of urban agriculture. While those are true, rapid urbanization and a lack of planning can also lead to grabbing of land and properties or other resources. And grabbing can result in greater inequity. It usually reinforces existing inequities. And inequity is known to have a negative impact on health and well-being. A problem in terms of planning is the fact that accurate data with regard to health, and that includes sexual and reproductive health, usually does not exist, or if it exists, it is very poor quality. It's not accessible to the people who actually need it for their planning. So in Meghalaya, there are simply no disaggregated data in urban areas. So you wouldn't know what data come from a slum, what data come from a very rich middle class area, and sometimes there's also overlap between urban and rural areas, because with urbanization, rural areas are being integrated into the city. So what used to be a rural area can quickly transform into an urban or a peri-urban area. Another problem in terms of getting access to evidence and data is that many people in these unplanned areas or slum areas use private or traditional health providers. And these providers are not integrated or not linked to state health service providers. So even if the state health service providers would be providing data, there is big gaps in terms of the health services that people are using because they're not going to these state health service providers. So this mix of formal and informal health providers can also be seen to include private sector, although private sector is sometimes treated as separate. But this mix of different types of health providers is something that is very common in urban areas, and it's particularly common in slum areas. So while the services in these areas might keep some record, as they are not linked, they cannot inform a national or an urban or a slum-wide policy or strategy. So as a result, the evidence to inform policy is lacking. Now, it's true that it is very difficult to collect evidence in these rapidly changing urban environments. People move, they're not home, they might not be interested. But you can also wonder, well, is it really easy to collect data in remote rural areas with the poor roads, the many languages, urban-rural divide? Actually, very little is known about how to collect data in urban unplanned communities, which sounds a bit strange because we all know that they exist and we have known that they exist for many decades now. But here's why. In a rural setting, you might have a chief or headman or some other traditional authority that you can approach to ask how you should operate, how you should work, who you should speak with, how you should behave. And when researchers would make the effort to talk with local residents, it's usually quite easy to identify who is important in this village and who is invisible. So in urban unplanned areas, this is very different. You may not know who you should go to. You may not know who is responsible. And if you don't know who to go to, then it's difficult to get cooperation. Cooperation in terms of even meeting the people that might have data or that might help you to collect some data. So in these unplanned urban environments, survey teams often find closed doors because people are out working. I mean, they're there just to sleep. They're very busy. And when they come home, they have no time or they have no interest to speak with researchers. There is in general often less social cohesion, which also makes it harder for researchers to collect data. And some participatory group-based methods that work really well in the village actually fail when you try to apply them in an unplanned urban setting. People simply have no time and they cannot be easily called together for a meeting. And again, who would call for that meeting? It's difficult to get the information, but this lack of attention and the lack of focus and the lack of priority to get evidence about unplanned urban setting is also a political choice. It's a matter of priority setting. Many of the inhabitants are considered to be poor and temporary. Actually, that is not necessarily the case. Within these so-called slums, there are many different types of dwellings, reflecting the diversity of the inhabitants. There's a lot of upward social mobility, and if you take a good look, you can find a lot of businesses, not just trade or selling a few vegetables or a little bit of fruit or some food, but real businesses, productive businesses, cottage industries that even produce for export. And they are based in those areas because the rent is lower. So Kibera cottage industry, for example, produce tourist objects for other countries, and these countries maybe as far as Zambia. So also many slums have been in existence for decades. So it actually requires an act of will to ignore their existence. And it's high time that people start collecting the evidence and the data that we need to improve health in those areas. In part 2, I'll be talking about parallel and informal governance in unplanned urban areas. Although, of course, they're not unique to unplanned urban area, but they're quite noteworthy.